Good day, everyone. Today we will be presenting the history of journalism in the world and in the Philippines. Before we begin, let me ask you a one question. Where do you get your news every day? Is it from social media, television, radio, or maybe from a newspaper? Good day, everyone. How are you all feeling today? I hope you're doing great. Before we start our discussion about the history of journalism in the world and in the Philippines, let's have a quick activity first. I will show you the name of a famous newspaper or publication, and I want you to guess which period it belongs to. You can answer on your mind or write it down on a piece of paper. Ready? Let's begin. This is the first one, the Successus Felicis, published in 1637. Is this from early years or the revolutionary period? You have 5 seconds to think. Ta-da-dang, ta-da-dang. The answer is early years. It was published by Thomas Pinpin, the father of Filipino printing. Great job! The second is La Solidaridad. This was the newspaper of Rizal and Del Pilar. When do you think it was published? Ta-da-nan, ta-da-nan. That's right. Period of Revolution. It was the voice of the reform movement. The third is Philippine Daily Inquirer. This is one of the newspapers we read today. Is this from the American period or contemporary times? Time's up. Correct. Contemporary times. It was born after the 1986 People Power Revolution. Great job, everyone. Now, let's take a moment to think about what we just did. Did you find something interesting from our answers? First, look at the Successus Felicis from the early years. It was small, simple, and written in Spanish. Back then, journalism was just starting. It was mostly used to announce news and information. Then, look at La Solidaridad from the period of revolution. It wasn't just reporting news anymore. It had a voice, it had a purpose, it was used to fight for change, to speak up, and to awaken the nation. And finally, the Philippine Daily Inquirer from contemporary times. It is free, independent, and continues to speak the truth today. It was born when our people regained their freedom. So, what does this tell us? It tells us that journalism changes as our nation changes. When we had little freedom, our newspapers were small and limited. When we fought for our rights, our newspapers became brave and powerful. And when we regained our freedom, our press became free too. Newspapers are not just paper and ink, they are the voice of the people. They reflect our history, our struggles, and our freedom. And that is the story we are going to share with you today, the history of journalism from the ancient world right here to our own Philippines. We are so used to having information right at our fingertips, but have you ever wondered how did journalism begin? Who started it? Or how did it evolve from simple announcements to the powerful force it is today? Class, can you please read the definition of the journalism, please? Yes, thank you. And journalism is not just about reporting facts. It is the story of how humanity learned to shape the truth, speak up, and connect with one another. And that is exactly what we will explore today. From ancient walls of Rome to the newspapers that shaped our own nation. So let's begin with the history of journalism in the world. Journalism started thousands of years ago in ancient civilization. Back then, there were no newspaper, and the rulers simply wrote the important announcements on walls and clay tablets and displayed them in the public places where everyone could see it. And later, in ancient Rome, they created something called Acta Diurna. These were daily public records posted in the forums that recorded official news, government decrees, and events. This was like the very first newspaper, handwritten and posted where everyone could read it. During Middle Ages, handwritten newsletters and trade bulletins circulated among merchants and governments. But everything changed in the 1440s when Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press. This was a revolution. For the first time, information could be reproduced quickly, easily, and shared widely across many people. By the 16th and 17th century, regular newspapers began appearing across Europe. Then, in the 18th century, something very important happened. The free press developed. Newspapers became independent and began acting as a check on government power. Journalism began as a voice for the people. In the 19th century, faster printing and the invention of telegraph changed everything again. News could travel instantly over long distances, and newspapers could reach huge audiences and be printed faster than ever before. The 20th century brought even bigger changes. Radio and television arrived, and suddenly, journalism was no longer just about text. It became something you could hear and something you can see. And finally, we enter the internet era. Today, journalism is instant, global, digital, and multimedia. News reaches us almost the moment it happens anywhere in the world. So, to summarize, journalism evolved from public announcements on walls and clay tablets, handwritten newsletters and printed newspapers, radio and television, and now digital and online journalism. It has grown alongside human progress and it continues to evolve every single day.
Good day, everyone. Today, I will be reporting on the history of journalism in the Philippines. I'll be tracing its development from the earliest Spanish era publications all the way to the emergence of a free and independent press. So let's begin. The early years. Philippine journalism can be traced back as far as the 17th century, when printed materials were first used to report events and spread information to the public. Let's go through the key milestones of this era one by one. In 1637, a printer named Thomas Pinpin, who is now remembered as the father of Filipino printing, published a work called Successos Felices. This is considered one of the earliest Philippine newsletters, and it was written in Spanish. Moving forward to 1799, we have what were called hojas volantes, or flying sheets. These were simple single-page publications, and one notable example included in this category was called Aviso al Público. Then on August 8, 1811, Del Superior Gobierno was published. This is widely considered the first actual newspaper in the Philippines. However, it was short-lived and it only ran for 15 issues. Several decades later, on December 1, 1846, La Esperanza became the first daily newspaper in the country, a major milestone, since it meant news could now reach readers on a regular day-to-day basis. In 1862, El Católico Filipino was published as the first religious newspaper in the Philippines, reflecting the strong influence of the church during this period. By 1865, El Porvenir Filipino made history by pioneering the two-edition daily newspaper format, publishing not just once but twice a day. And finally, on April 1, 1887, La Opinion became notable as the first newspapers to openly oppose the friars, a bold move that hinted at the growing spirit of dissent that would soon define the next era of Philippine journalism. Now, as we move into this next period, the period of revolution, journalism took on a much more powerful role. It became an important instrument in the fight for reforms, nationalism, and independence. The most significant publication of this era was La Solidaridad, founded on February 19, 1889. It served as the official mouthpiece of the reform movement, giving voice to Filipino intellectuals who were calling for change under Spanish rule. Some of its famous contributors included Jose Rizal, Marcelo H. del Pilar, and Graciano Lopez Haina. These three names, of course, are some of the most recognized figures in the Philippine history, and their writings helped ignite the reform movement across the country. Then on January 1, 1896, ang Kalayaan emerged, this time associated directly with the Katipunan, the secret revolutionary society. Unlike La Solidaridad, which pushed for peaceful reform, ang Kalayaan used journalism to actively support the armed revolutionary movement against Spain. Aside from these two major publications, there were also other revolutionary papers that contributed to the cause, including El Heraldo de Ilolo, La Libertad, and La Independencia. Together, these publications show just how deeply intertwined journalism was with the Filipino people's struggles for freedom. To summarize, Philippine journalism began as a simple tool for spreading information under Spanish colonization. Starting with Thomas Pinpin's early printing work in the 1600s, over time it evolved from single newsletters to the first true newspapers, and eventually into a powerful weapon for reform and revolution, giving voice to heroes like Rizal, Del Pilar, and Lopez Haina. This history reminds us that journalism in the Philippines was never just about reporting the news. It was about shaping the nation's identity and fighting for its freedom. So thank you, and that concludes my report.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Lara Silipon, and I'll be the one who will continue the discussion of the history of journalism and the Philippines. So, journalism in the Philippines is more than just newspapers, news reports, and information. Throughout our history, journalism became a powerful way for Filipinos to express their ideas, promote nationalisms, expose injustice, and resist oppression. So, as we go through the different periods, we will see how journalism changed depending on the situation of the country. So, from the struggle against the Spanish colonial rule to American and Japanese occupation, and eventually to the martial law, and journalists continued to play an important role until now in shaping Filipino society. So, let's begin one of the most important periods in the development of Filipino journalism. So first we have the revolutionary journalism. So during the revolutionary period, journalism became an important instrument in the fight for Philippine independence. So Filipino intellects and revolutionaries used newspapers and publications to spread the ideas about freedom, equality, and reforms and national identity. So one important example was La Solidaridad, which was founded in Spain in 1889. So it became the voice of the Filipino reform movement. So writers such as Jose Rizal, I know you are familiar with him, Marcelo H. Del Pilar, and Graciano Lopez Hiena. Is that Hiena? So used journalism to criticize abuses committed by Spanish authorities and to call for reforms. So but then later on, during the Philippine Revolution or revolutionary publications such as Kalayaan, associated with the Katipunan, that helped spread revolutionary ideas and encourage Filipinos to fight for independence. I know some of you are actually familiar with the Kalayaan and the Katipunan. No? So the main contribution of revolutionary journalism was its role in developing Filipino nationalism. So through newspapers and writings, Filipinos began to see themselves not simply as subjects of Spain, but as a Filipino with a shared identity and desire for freedom. So that time we are actually seeking for freedom, no? As you can see or what you read in the history of the Philippines. So journalism, therefore, became a form of resistance. Instead of using weapons alone, Filipino writers used words, ideas, and information to challenge colonial rule. So, in short, revolutionary journalism helped Filipinos think, speak, and fight as a nation. The press became a weapon of ideas in the struggle for freedom. But after the Spanish period and the Philippine Revolution, a new colonial power arrived, and that is the United States. And this brought major changes to Philippines journalism. Now, let's move on to American colonial period. So during this period, journalism developed significantly because of the introduction and expansion of the American style press. Newspapers became more organized, and the use of English became increasingly important because of the American educational system. However, journalism during this period was not completely free from political influence, and the press operated within the political and social conditions created by American colonial rule. So at the same time, Filipino journalists continued to use newspapers to discuss independence, Filipino identity, government, and social issues. Journalism continued to contribute the nationalism by giving Filipinos a space to express their opinions about the country's future. During this period, the newspaper became a place where Filipinos could debate important questions, just like who should govern the Philippines, what does it mean to be a Filipino, and when should the Philippines become independent. So therefore, even though the Philippines was under the American colonial rule, journalism helped maintain the Filipino desire for national identity and independence. So the American period helps Philippine journalism. Here's a simple explanation. The American period helped Philippines journalism become more modern and organized. And at the same time, Filipino journalists continued to use the press to express nationalism and advocate for greater freedom and independence. Now, let's move on to the Japanese period. The Japanese occupation of the Philippines from 1942 to 1945 was one of the most difficult periods for Philippine journalism. Why? Because during the occupation, the Japanese government imposed strict control over newspapers and other forms of media. So many newspapers were closed, while the publication that were allowed to operate was subject to censorship. News and information had to follow the rules of the Japanese authorities. So because of this, the journalists had very limited freedom to report and what was actually happening in the country. So despite the censorship, then journalism did not completely disappear. So some Filipinos participated in the underground press, which provided information that could not freely be published by the controlled newspapers. In simple explanation, during the Japanese period, journalism was heavily controlled. But Filipino journalists and resistance groups found ways to share information to underground publications, and in this way, journalism became a form of resistance against censorship and occupation. And after the Japanese occupation ended in 1945, the Philippines entered a period of rebuilding, and with the return of the freedom, the Philippine press also began to recover. And now let's move to the post-liberation period. The post-liberation period began after the liberation of the Philippines from Japanese occupation. But the country was rebuilding not only its cities and economy, but also its democratic institutions. So during this period, newspapers, other media organizations became active. The press regained greater freedom to report news, discuss political issues, and criticize government policies. So journalism became an important part of the country's democratic system in this period because it provided citizens with information about government and society. Journalists, no, in this period, journalists continued to contribute to nationalism by reporting issues about affected Filipino communities and by encouraging public discussion. The press also served as a watchdog, and I know you are familiar with the word watchdog. A watchdog in journalism means the journalist observe government and other powerful institutions and report problems or abuses to the public. So this was important because a free press allowed people to question leaders and demand accountability. So, in sample explanation, after liberation, Philippines journalism regained much of its freedom. So, newspapers became important in rebuilding democracy and giving Filipinos a voice in political and social issues. The next period is the martial law period. The martial law period began in 1972 under President Ferdinand Marcos. One of the major effects of martial law was was the restriction of press freedom. So several newspapers, radio stations, and television stations were shut down. Media organizations that were allowed to operate were placed under strict government control and censorship. Because of these restrictions, journalists could not freely report many political issues, government abuses, and opposition activities. Despite the censorship and pressure, some journalists continued to resist through what became known as the alternative or underground press. These publications attempted to provide information that was not being reported by government-controlled media. So journalists and writers who continued to report on political and social issues demonstrated that journalism could serve as a form of resistance. The press also became important in documenting the experiences of people during a period when freedom of expression was severely restricted. So a simple overview, during martial law, press freedom was heavily restricted, but journalists and alternative publications continued to provide information and challenge censorship. So their work showed the importance of journalism in protecting truth, freedom, and democracy. Okay, let's have a quick summary. So revolutionary period. This is the period where journalism helped develop nationalism and encourage resistance against Spanish colonial rule. And next is the American colonial period, where journalism became more modern and organized while continuing to provide a space for discussions about Filipino identity, self-government, and independence. Next is the Japanese period. Journalism was heavily censored, but underground publications continue to provide information and support the resistance. Then next is the post-liberation period. The press regained greater freedom and became an important part of rebuilding Philippine democracy. And lastly, martial law, which the martial law period, where the press freedom was once again restricted, but journalists and alternative publications continued to resist censorship and inform the public. So in conclusion, from this period, we can see that the history of journalism in the Philippines is closely connected to the history of the Filipino people. So journalism was not simply about delivering news; it became a way to educate public, express nationalism, expose problems, challenge authority, and defend freedom. So from revolutionary writers who used their words against colonial rule to journalists who worked under censorship and political repression, the Philippine press has continuously shown the importance of information and society. So and this gives us an important lesson. So when people have access to their full information, they have a stronger voice in shaping their society and their country. So that is why journalism remains an important part of Philippine democracy. So that's all, everyone. Thank you for listening, and I hope this discussion helped you understand how journalism developed alongside the struggles and changes of the Filipino nation. Bye.
Good day, everyone. I am Jothral Manafed, and I will be continuing to discuss the history of journalism in the world and in the Philippines in the context of contemporary times. So, during 1986, people power revolutions marked the restoration of press freedom. Newspapers emerged and became the important sources of information of Filipinos. So this means that people power revolutions ended the Marcos dictatorships and helped the democracy and press freedom in the Philippines. Important facts: during 1986, press freedom was restored. Journalists and media organizations were once again allowed to report news and express opinions with greater freedom, and newspapers emerged, including the Philippine Daily Inquirer, Philippine Star, and Manila Standard. The Philippine Daily Inquirer emerged as one of the newspapers that became an important source of news after the restorations of press freedom, and Philippine Star was established as another major newspaper that contributed to the growing Philippine press, and the Manila Standard became another important newspaper that emerged in the period of renewed press freedom. Remember this, that in world journalism, the ancient announcement before newspaper, people receive important information through public announcements, messengers, inscriptions, and other forms of communications. And the Acta Diurna was an ancient Roman daily record of public events and news, often considered an early form of published news. And the printing press. The invention of printing press made it possible to produce written information quickly and in large quantities. And newspapers. The invention of newspapers became an organized way of regularly providing people the news, opinions, and informations
about society, and the radio and television. Radio and television allowed news to reach much larger audiences more quickly through sounds and moving images. And lastly, the internet. The internet transformed journalism by allowing news to be published and accessed instantly by people around the world. And let's move forward to Philippine journalism. In Philippine journalism, the early publications introduced Filipinos to printed informations and helped develop public awareness and communication. And the revolutionary press. During the Philippine revolutions, newspapers and publications became important tools for spreading ideas of freedom, nationalism, and independence. And in during the American period, Philippine journalism expanded with the growth of newspapers and development of more organized press system. The Japanese occupation. During the World War II, journalism was heavily controlled by the Japanese, but some journalists continued to communicate information through underground or resistant publications. And the post-liberations. After the liberations, Philippine journalism grew again as newspapers and other media helped rebuild society and strengthen the public discussion. And the martial law. During the martial law, press freedom was severely restricted, while some journalists and publications resisted censorship and continued to report important issues. And lastly, the contemporary press. Today, Philippine journalism uses newspapers, televisions, radio, websites, and social media to provide information to the public in a rapidly changing media environment. So, overall, journalism in the Philippines evolved from simple printed news into a powerful tool for information, reform, nationalism, and resistance and democracy. Throughout history, journalists have helped inform the public, expose important issues, give people a voice, and defend the people's right to know. So, the history of journalism is not only the history of newspapers and media, it is also the history of how people communicated information, express ideas, challenge power, and participate in society. So, it is also a powerful tool that informs people, promotes change, and protects freedom, and lastly, supports democracy. So that would be all for the history of Philippine journalism in the world and in the Philippines. I hope you learned something today. Thank you.